The people want to hear more about the Bone Wars, so let's go. Despite being famous for their bitter, intense, obsessive rivalry that defined decades of American paleontology and created such mountains of chaotic, sloppy, rushed, and occasionally brilliant work that modern paleontologists are still sifting through it a century and a half later, Othniel Marsh and Edward Cope were friends for years. They first met in Berlin in 1863. Cope was male, healthy, and in his early 20s, and so his father had sent him to Europe to keep him from getting drafted into the Civil War. Marsh was working for Yale and studying anatomy at Berlin, and he was in his early 30s, which I mention because I think it's actually relevant to the psychology of the whole thing. Cope was notably intense and insecure about earning the approval of his actual father in a way that seems to have carried over to his behavior towards other mentor figures and potential mentor figures in his adult life, and I just can't help but feel like that has something to do with the psychology of this. So that's my armchair psych take. They met in Berlin, they were studying anatomy together, and they hit it off. So Cope went traveling elsewhere in Europe, came back, they stayed together for a few days, and maybe murdered someone. That is a joke. That is my joke conspiracy theory, but he sure did go back to America and burn all of his journals and correspondence, so as you do when you're a very stable genius. Whatever that was about, they stayed in touch afterwards. Their letters to each other are not especially intense, but like they're clearly friends, you know, my dear so-and-so, with kind regards, your friend, etc. They were definitely still friends by 1867 when Cope discovered this fossil amphibian and gave it the species name Marshii in Marsh's honor. The next year, 1868, Marsh discovered a species of Mosasaurus, which he gave the species name Copii, or no, Copianus, sorry. Mosasaurus copianus is kind of where things start to get a little tense between them. Marsh collected this specimen in New Jersey, where Cope had also been doing fossil prospecting, and Cope privately referred to this specimen as the one that got away, to imply that, like, he was upset that Marsh got to describe it and he did not get to describe it. But things were about to get so much worse between them because also in 1868, this guy in Kansas called Dr. Theophilus H. Turner dug up and sent to Cope this thing. This specimen is widely considered to be the inciting incident for the Bone Wars. Now, I have made no secret of the fact that I think a lot of Cope's work was bad, and a lot of his mistakes, paleontologically, were stupid mistakes. This is not one of them, because first of all, this creature was found extremely disarticulated. These bones were not lined up the way that they were in life, but the guy who excavated it, Dr. Turner, told Cope that the head was found closer to these vertebrae than to the other vertebrae, and in Cope's defense, Elasmosaurus had no business having a neck that looked like this. So Cope spent more than a year putting all these bones back together, and he carved this diagram, and he submitted it for publication. He actually noticed that the neck vertebrae articulated weirdly, and that was actually part of the paper that he submitted, and he had done all of this work, and then Marsh paid him a visit and looked at this and said, "Hey, your guy is backwards." According to Marsh, he said this very politely. According to Cope, it was needlessly cruel, and Cope could not handle it. So then, very stable genius that he was, Cope tried to steal Marsh's bones. He showed up at one of Marsh's dig sites while Marsh wasn't there and said to the excavators, "Hey, Professor Marsh told me to take these bones that you were excavating back to Philadelphia instead of to Yale." And the excavators saw right through this, turned him away, and immediately wrote to Marsh, and then they spent the next 2 decades doing a Bone Wars about it. You know what, there are so many historical scientists who I think seem like delightful people, and I would love to have a beer with them, and Edward Cope is really fun to read about, and I'm glad he's dead.